Welcome everyone to this event on decolonial perspectives on Central and Southeast Europe. My name's Anna Gawlewicz and I'm one of the organizers of this webinar. I'm really thrilled to see so many people joining in. We have 400 registered participants and 165 participants at the moment and more people joining as we speak. So it's really, really fantastic to see everyone here today. So the event is scheduled for 2 hours and it will involve a short introduction just in a second, 4 talks from our fantastic speakers and a question and answer session. And before we start, let me just very briefly talk you through the housekeeping. So the event is being recorded, as you can see in the left upper corner of your screen. Your microphone is muted and your video is turned down to avoid disruptions. For the question and answer session, we will invite you to unmute yourself and turn on your video to ask questions directly. But you can also ask questions in the chat box. Please note that the video, sound and chat messages are saved as part of the live recording. So if you don't wish to appear in the recording, please use private chat to ask questions. In the spirit of sharing, we'll post the recording from the event online on YouTube and we'll send you all a link via Eventbrite when it's ready. And finally, we'll be using the chat box to post short messages about existing networks, existing events, reading lists. And feel free to add to this, but please keep these messages short to allow everyone to enjoy the talks and discussions on screen. Without further ado, I'll now hand over to my colleague, Kasia Narkowicz, who will say a few words about our network and our motivations to organize this event. Thank you and enjoy.
Hi everyone, it's amazing to see already 172 people and more coming each second, literally. So I'll just spend 5 minutes just introducing you to what we're doing. So this event is the first event of our research network, which is called PostCEE, Post-Dependence Geographies in Central and Eastern Europe. This network is funded by the Regional Studies Association and it just started this year and it will run for 3 years. And we will hold events each year, and we'll also hold an event at the RSA annual meeting. So the network is run by Anna Gawlewicz, who you just heard from. She's based at University of Glasgow. Konrad Pędziwiatr, who is based in Cracow at the Cracow University of Economics. Myself, I'm based at Middlesex University. And this event is also organized in collaboration with Špela, Drnovšek, Zorko from University of Warwick. So we have decided to join forces today to continue conversations that have developed in the last few years at various points and locations among scholars of Eastern Europe. There have been too many contributions to list them all individually, and chances are that each and every one of us here today have followed slightly different routes and genealogies to arrive at the questions that we're exploring today. Instead, we'd like to acknowledge the collective effort that has made it possible to engage with post-colonial, decolonial, and post-dependence theories from multiple perspectives and disciplines and build on the work of scholars and activists who've come before us. And many, many of these people are with us today, which we're really excited about. And thank you for your work. We'd also like to acknowledge several networks and events that have come together in previous years, in recent years, including the dialoguing between the post events that happened in Belgrade in 2017 and 2019, when these conversations sort of started escalating. Colleagues have also held dialogues in India, in Romania, in Czech Republic, in Kosovo, in Hungary, and most recently there have been a few events virtually. So with every event, it seems that the community of scholars attempting to think post and decolonially about the regions that we study is growing. Our conversations are deepening and we are starting to think productively about how to challenge the deep hegemonies that run across Western academia. And in the spirit of sharing resources, we'll be posting some links in the chat box to some of these initiatives and outputs. But please also, as I know that many of you are organizing networks events, please share all of these resources in the chat so that people can sort of take part in that. So over the past few years and in the current context of the pandemic, which affects us all, questions about the rise of the far right, increased migrations, economic inequality, and the urgency of decolonial projects have gained new interest in the region. At the same time, theoretical perspectives on the region have long grappled with the meaning of post-socialist, post-colonial, and post-dependence geographies. Sometimes we disagree about how to understand these spaces as being both within and outside of Europe. We also grapple with the challenge to acknowledge and connect across our shared Eastern European geographies, while also acknowledging that we are different and being mindful and not reducing us to a homogeneous static space. Despite these disagreements and challenges, there is, it seems, a shared sense that the position of Central East Europe and Southeast Europe, with their diverse and changing histories and of dependence, of domination, and ambivalent entanglements, as well as complicities in global colonial relations, deserve more attention. So with this in mind, the aim of this event is to explore the potential of using decolonial frameworks to researching Central East Europe and Southeast Europe, and to discuss analytical value in collectively conceptualizing these relational geographies through the movement of people, spatial imaginaries, and forms of border work. So the questions that we are posing today are, how can we conceptualize Eastern Europe in research? How do post-dependence, post-colonial, and decolonial approaches to the region help us define, reorient, and build resistances? How can we use post-dependence, post-colonial, and decolonial approaches to respond to some of the challenges in the region, including epistemic inequalities between East and West, anti-migrant and xenophobic politics, and the right-wing cooptation of post-colonial terminology? And what are the potential and limitations of these theories and approaches? So we have asked 4 scholars who work on the region, Hana Červinková, Piro Rexhepi, Claudia Snochowska-Gonzalez, and Ivan Kalmar, to speak broadly to these 3 questions that we have posed to them and that we pose to you as the audience as well. So each speaker has got 10 minutes to reflect, after which we will open the floor to questions and answers as well as broader discussion. So we hope that you will enjoy this conversation, stay in touch, and I will now hand over to Špela, who will introduce our first speaker. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kasia. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker for today. Hana Červinková is Professor and Head of the Department of Anthropology at Maynooth University in Ireland. She's an educational and urban anthropologist with a geographic focus on East and Central Europe, who specializes in anthropology and ethnography of post-socialist transformation, educational and anthropological participatory research methodologies, educational diversity, and the politics of historical memory. Her current ethnographic work highlights issues of nationalism, citizenship, memory, and belonging as they emerge in the everyday discourses and practices of civic and historical education in Polish schools. The politics of memory and history figure prominently in her ongoing urban-based research, much of which she has dedicated to exploring and making public the hidden and silenced memories of the formerly multicultural societies of Central Europe. Over to you, Hana.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Hana.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers, Špela, Kasia, Konrad, and Anya, for the invitation, which I very much welcomed as an opportunity to think further into what I generally see as a very hopeful development: the continued and growing transdisciplinary interest in bringing the post-colonial and decolonial frameworks into how we understand Central Europe and how that part of Europe can play a role in imagining our common global futures. This interest is reflected in the number of publications, conferences, and workshops such as this one, which drew participation that I believe must have shocked the organizers themselves. And it is also discernible in long-term collaborative institutionalized initiatives, such as the activities of the Post-Dependence Geographies in Central and Eastern Europe network that organized this event, the establishment of the Inter-University Post-Dependence Center Cooperative in Poland, or the Decolonizing Research Initiative in England, among others. I see this thinking between the posts, post-colonialism, post-dependence, and post-socialism, post-communism, as an important response to the changing political, economic, and social geographies of power in the post-Cold War world, and a chance for experiences of our other Europe to play a part in conceptualizing how we imagine and construct our worlds. What I find most inspiring about the post-colonial and decolonial frameworks are their emancipatory possibilities and aspirations grounded in critical methodologies, which grow out of indigenous epistemological critique of the persistence of colonialism in the post-colonial present. In that way, they are quite different from the frameworks of post-socialism and post-communism, which were largely developed as analytical tools by Western scholars to analyze the societies of the former communist bloc, and which many of us adopted into our scholarly repertoires. I believe that our attraction to the post-colonial lies in its intellectually empowering critique of the persistent inequalities that arise from the historical hold that colonialism has had on our worlds and minds. For one thing is certain, the whole world is haunted by the colonial in ways and dimensions that are still difficult to grasp. And it is the bringing of these phantoms to light where I believe the liberatory aspirations of post-colonial theory can be particularly useful, in inspiring us to delve into the much-needed examination of the colonial as it haunts our respective other European worlds. But I worry that the hegemonic and ever-growing power of the national over our public imaginaries leads us to interpret and turn the decolonial and post-colonial critical eye onto the outside rather than the inside. And instead of examining our own pasts and legacies of oppression as they have been happening under the umbrella of the global supremacy of the colonial, we engage in the uninspiring and circular self-defining game vis-a-vis the West. What the post-colonial offers to us is the chance to examine structures of oppression created by the colonial that we have ourselves been a part of, and which have been used against internal and external others. Such critique can be therapeutic and freeing, as opposed to our continued tendency to the displacing of responsibility onto the outside, which seems to be the feature of our comfortable liminal geopolitical location between the West and the East. Instead of defining ourselves against the West, I wish we would let the decolonial to unsilence the colonial in our cultural and political imaginations, and thus help us become part of the exciting developments inspired by visions of social justice that the decolonial thought sparked in other parts of the world. For years, I have been struck by the silences that cover our legacies of internal colonialism and racism, the landscape of silence that cover the history of the Holocaust and persecution of minorities. I have been fascinated and troubled by the process that I refer to as the production of homogeneity, whereby through discursive and material practices, many Central European societies are engaged in the ongoing silencing of diversity and reaffirmations of the homogeneity of belonging. The growing intertwining of authoritarianism, nationalism, and the silencing of the Holocaust, for example, in Poland and Hungary, have made me skeptical of the possibilities of drawing on the post-colonial to inspire self-examination of the colonial in our worlds. But one of the strongest disappointments to me personally as to the power of the post-colonial to inspire critical discernment of our own post-colonial world has been the reception of the Black Lives Matter protests in Central Europe. This was brought to sharp view from me, both in personal communications and contacts with friends and colleagues in Poland and the Czech Republic, and also most recently in the process of writing a paper with my US-based colleague, Beth Rubin. We called it A Deafening Silence, Race and History in US and Polish Schools, and we wanted to draw on our ongoing school-based research in US and Poland to speak about the violence of discursive silencing within school-based historical education when it comes to the history of colonialism and racism. Between March, when we submitted the proposal, and August, when the conference took place, however, the context has been transformed by the resounding loudness of anti-racist protests in the United States and worldwide in the wake of the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police, thought by many to be the largest social movement in US history. The contrast between the United States, where the deafening silence on racial injustice in the history and memory of the nation has been disrupted by the loudness of massive public protests, and that of post-Holocaust, post-socialist Poland, where nationalist homogeneity is tightening its grip on public discourse and historical and civic imaginary, and silence pervades, was disappointing and disheartening. In this geopolitical context, however, I'm beginning to think the importance of post-colonial imagination to help counter the deafening silence of nationalism and opening up space for nurturing of diverse historical and civic imaginaries is perhaps the more important. Thank you.
Thank you, Hana. That was really fantastic. I now have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Piro Rexhepi. Piro holds a PhD in politics from the University of Strathclyde. His research focuses on decoloniality, sexuality, and Islam. His recent work on racism and borders along the Balkan refugee route has been published in a range of mediums in and out of academia, including the International Journal of Postcolonial Studies, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Critical Muslims, and The Guardian, among others. Piro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you also, Kasia, Špela, and Konrad for the invitation and for organizing this. So I want to follow Hana by citing one of her most cited paragraphs on post-socialism from 2012, where she points out that unlike post-colonialism, quote, born as a project of indigenous epistemological critique of the persistence of colonialism in post-colonial present with emancipatory liberatory implications, post-socialism was developed as an analytical tool by Western scholars to analyze the former societies of the communist bloc. So this hegemonic epistemology of post-socialism makes it a very different concept from post-colonialism and raises questions concerning its usefulness as an intellectually empowering tool for scholars in challenging local inequalities arising from the effect of global capitalism, end quote. So for most of us in post-socialist East European studies, this quotation, which is one of the most frequently cited ones, has resonated so deeply precisely because it tackles two interrelated tensions that continue to haunt us. On the one hand, our vocabularies, conceptual concerns, spatial and temporal constellations have largely been shaped by Western anthropologists and area study specialists. Consequently, as Hana just pointed out, this also comes to impact how we understand and speak of local inequities arising both from global capitalism, but also the cumulative effects of coloniality. So as a result, we continue to think of colonialism in the third world, socialism in the second world, and racism in the first, along those very spatial and temporal coordinates of colonial epistemologies and Cold War categories. This is why, for instance, we can't think of, say, Algeria or Angola or Egypt or South Yemen as post-socialist, but only as post-colonial. And we continue to think similarly of Chechnya, Dagestan, Bosnia, and Kosovo only as post-socialist or post-conflict, but very rarely, if ever, as post-colonial. This is the same reason why the former Second World is nearly absent also in critical race and decolonial scholarship, and we struggle to understand what would a decolonial perspective on Central and Southeastern Europe would entail as this workshop theme is organized around. I want to start with a recap of a recent workshop on a similar theme that I participated in, and many participants here, from what I can tell from the names, were part of. By doing this, I don't mean to engage in any dilemma or discredit the workshop. I rather want to open up and connect conversations on coloniality across different and now multiple clusters that have emerged across different disciplines addressing decoloniality in Eastern Europe. In order for our endeavors to be meaningful, I think it's necessary that we have to have honest conversations on what decoloniality could mean or how it could be taken up to avoid the risk of simply reproducing coloniality and reinforcing some of its operating systems such as racism, Orientalism, and so forth. So this workshop, Understanding the Role of Eastern Europe in Global Colonization Debates and Decolonial Struggles, was broadly organized around the afterlives of colonialism and racism in Eastern Europe, as well as the peripheralization of Eastern Europeans in Western academia. The second theme stuck with me as a chord because at a time when the EU strategic deployment of academic research towards the integration of borders in Eastern and Southeastern Europe is proposed as a possible solution to various concerns that Eastern European academics have that may not be necessarily taken seriously. So by pointing this out, I'm not suggesting that the marginalization of Eastern European academics in the West isn't a significant issue. Quite the contrary, many of us are precariously employed or unemployed, as we know. What I'm saying is that this is not necessarily a matter of decolonization or decolonial struggle. Far from it, as myself and many participants have already pointed out, we are still privileged in the West in as much as we are frequently white, passing, and have relative freedom of movement and access in labor markets, and many times conveniently can check certain diversity boxes as and when necessary. Meanwhile, those people that were historically colonized, expelled, marked for extermination, or faced in one or another form organized violence from our local, regional, and collective contexts are nearly absent. So what you usually get sometimes in this perspective from the Balkans, for instance, is scholars like Maria Todorova, whose work and position is one of privilege, both in the local context that she covers, but also the work that she does. Unsurprisingly then, her definition of, let's say, Balkan as Christian and really European leaves Roma, Muslim, Jewish, Pomak, Turks in Bulgaria or the Balkans wondering what and whom she is really talking about. So with the positioning of Eastern Europeans broadly as victims of Eurocoloniality, the more protracted forms of violence within our communities frequently remained unaddressed. So I bring these points out here to illustrate some of the ways in which whiteness and Eastern Europe as a geography function as a capital that the privileged post-socialist subject can claim, trade, and negotiate in the racial and colonial marketplace of European epistemology. In this sense, the narratives woven through decolonial language illustrate the geopolitical imaginaries that govern racial capitalism hierarchies and come to inform our post-socialist position in relationship to Europe and coloniality. In short, it sometimes feels that we seem less concerned with the coercive role we have come to play in maintaining Europe's borders in its east and south peripheries and its racial and religious purity, so to speak, and less so with speaking about the actual solidification of far-right and fascist regimes across the region, whose post-socialist revival in part is due to Europeanization processes. It has now been well argued by Hana, but also Dacia Janowska, Neda Tanasowski, Marina Grzinic, and Tjasa Kancler, among others. I think we have to be very careful here as we are falling into the geopolitical trap of Europe that wants to integrate or continuously integrate Eastern Europe and Eastern Europeans into the EU and seeking to draw this very distinct racial and religious border between the post-socialist and post-colonial subject and space. An example of this, for instance, is how the EU has poured immense funding, police, and prison equipment in places like Bosnia, Albania, and Serbia to control migrants from the Middle East and Africa from moving towards Europe. It is in this successful control of migration, then, among other conditions, that the promise of eventual integration into the EU becomes the ultimate price and privilege. The reason I choose to discuss this subject here is from a concern that decolonization has now become somewhat of an academized concept that offers the possibility for visibility and critical stance that can not only be dangerous in taking up space and co-opting what is political process of colonization means for people who daily struggle with decolonization, but also for fear that we should be very careful not to turn what Eve Talk has already warned us for decades, decolonization into a metaphor. This then brings me to the subject that we are discussing here, namely, how can we talk about other geographies in and of Europe, and what a decolonial perspective on Central and South Europe entail? For me, it seems impossible in this moment to talk about decoloniality without reflecting on positionality. In other words, who is speaking and who can speak, not just in relation to Western Europe or the US, but more importantly, among ourselves. So decolonizing knowledge isn't necessarily an easy or a straightforward or self-evident task, particularly since imperial and Eurocentric colonial knowledge production is not only dominant and pervasive, but it also has the tendency to pass for common sense, despite it being deeply entangled in contemporary political projects. With those questions in mind, I want to raise some more questions, namely, how do we engage in the decolonial perspectives from post-socialist positionality, not deployed and defined in relation to Euro-American geopolitical, spatial, and temporal coordinates, but as lived experiences of those most marginalized among our communities. In other words, how and what does Eastern and Southeastern Europe look, feel, and sound like if those histories were spoken by racialized and gendered communities in and of and from those spaces? Tackling these questions then will allow us to think and see through some of the more protracted forms of coloniality, whiteness, racism, misogyny, and heteronormativity in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. I want to bring here the work of Selma Selman, because I think her confrontation of Roma racism in the Balkan region unsettles not just the politics of the far right, but also the silence and compliance of racism within leftist movements in the region. One of the best commentaries in this intersection of racial capitalism, class, gender, and coloniality and post-socialism is her performance piece called Self-Portrait, which I encourage you to look up. It's on the internet. In this piece, Self-Portrait, Selma, who is a Roma artist from Bosnia, takes an electric waste that people deposit in Roma neighborhoods across the peripheries of post-socialist cities and demolishes it in the center of the city. In my conversation with Selma, she has described the process of the performance as wanting to spare no one from what the noise of capitalist violence sounds like. She says you can't deposit your waste in the periphery and return in the center and make abstract noise about rights. For instance, she chooses to demolish the washing machine because she was trying to point out how the work of waste recycling that takes place in Roma neighborhood forces us to reckon with the racist, gendered, but also environmental violence that is a product of capitalism. Selma's work is important because in confronting the post-socialist left and liberal peripheralization of questions of racism and refugees, it also exposes the comfortable collusion with the EU and its captive and carceral border regimes in the region. Selma comes from Bihać, the site of refugees, where the space once used for refugees from the Bosnian genocide now serves as a EU-sponsored camp for migrant detention, connecting her own racialized reality in Bosnia to that of the refugees that are being pursued along the Balkan route to prevent them from entering Europe. In another virtual reality performance called No Space, she says that, quote, "There is no space for you here," echoing the term that Roma people encounter in the Balkans and throughout Eastern Europe when looking for jobs or housing that is not disconnected from the same message that is being given to refugees when they are told that there is no space here for you. I think Selma's work illustrates the kind of political projects and questions that emerge from connecting posts to confront racial capitalism's coloniality that breaks from the colonial and Cold War area studies boxes. One question that post-socialist people need to address is to what extent socialism was a decolonizing project, not just in terms of self-determination, but more broadly as a process of reparations and redistribution, not just as socialism as it was a segment or segmented and studied as a second world brackets, but socialism more broadly as a decolonizing.
I hate to interrupt. Would you be able to wrap up?
Yes.
Thank you.
So to finish, how do we talk about other geographies in and of Europe, and what would a decolonial perspective in Central and Europe entail becomes an important question about decolonial praxis and primarily solidarity. While Roma, Jews, Muslims were racialized in Eastern Europe, what does it mean that their racialization is frequently subsumed and leveled on a broader critique of orientalization of the former socialist subject? So I want to raise the question of what does this erasure through leveling do? And more importantly, who speaks in the name of the post-socialist subject and who is taken seriously in these conversations? Thank you.
Piro, thank you so much for always being so thoughtful. I've taken so many notes. So I'm now going to introduce our third speaker, Dr. Claudia Snochowska-Gonzalez, who is a sociologist and cultural scientist. In her work, she focuses on the links between Polish post-coloniality, gender and nation, and on the reproductive rights and women's mobilizations to liberalize the anti-abortion law in Poland. In her current research at the Institute of Slavic Studies at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, she investigates folkist inspirations in Polish public life and the Central and Eastern European context of Polish early nationalism. Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Well, thank you for inviting me here. I'm very glad to have the chance to participate in this event. I think it's really necessary. So I'm going to speak from the Polish perspective with some reference to the broader, to the region. There are at least 3 ways or 3 traditions of using or developing post-colonial theory in the Polish context. And I want to focus only on one of them because, well, not only because I have no time to discuss them all, but also because this approach is the most popular outside the academia. And I think it shapes the Polish politics and public life. And the consequence of it is some kind of entanglement, characterizing Polish relationship to with the post-colonial topic in general. So by now it is the right wing in Poland that is in its rhetoric refers to this issue, and it does it in a way that allows it to be both colonial and anti-colonial at the same time. And it seems to me that this is typical not only for the Polish right, but maybe for the contemporary right wing in general. A characteristic feature of this approach is that it assumes that Poland is or may be a colonial subject, an actual or potential or former colonial power. In Poland, of course, we have a lot of historical examples of the attempts to position oneself on colonial mental maps in the place of the colonizer, of the conqueror, despite the absolute impossibility of realizing a real colonial conquest. So these are all of these attempts to, for example, colonize Africa or South America by a nation who that did not even exist as a state on a map, or some historical and current also attempts to carry out some civilization or colonization mission in the East, for example, in Ukraine or now in Belarus. And it is also the belief in being a defender of European civilization, of its Christian core, and guaranteeing its top position in the world. So this type of wishful thinking is referred to by researchers as a fantasy or as an aspiration, or as I do, as an exercise in expansion. And its aim is quite obvious. It is to manufacture and consolidate the Polish subject as a colonial subject, the one at the center of the modern capitalist and colonizing world. And on the other hand, it is also the right wing that now is putting a lot of the elements of its agenda within the anti-colonial frames. So it presents either the alleged gender ideology or the alleged LGBT ideology as an example of the European Union colonization, as an example of a virus from Brussels, Ebola from Brussels, as Elżbieta Korolczuk and Agnieszka Graf put it. And it describes any attempts to undermine its moral traditionalism as an attack from outside that must be fought off in the anti-colonial struggle. What is important, the right wing rewrites the matrix of the left wing description of the colonial world as if colonial competition was fought only between nations and only in cultural, not material terms. So not, for example, as a struggle between capital and labor. If the capital occurs at all, it always has nationality as its most important feature. And this contributes to, I think, to the great propaganda success of the right wing in Poland. The right-wing use of anti-colonial terminology is characterized by its complete abstraction from colonialism understood as one of the functions of capitalism, and thus it offers a certain kind of critique of capitalism, which can be expressed in national terms. On the other hand, this anti-colonial rhetoric is often explained as a reaction to the crisis of neoliberalism, or a reaction to the crisis of 2008, or a reaction to capitalism in general. Actually, I have more questions than answers. So I'm going to finish my my speech with some of these questions. These are the questions to you, to all of you. The first question is, why are anti-colonial frames so sexy that even the right wing has to use it? The second question is, why is, in the Polish context, but maybe not only in this context, why is the left ashamed to use this kind of rhetoric in political life? Because, as I argue, it is ashamed. The next question would be, well, is it only a question of propaganda effectiveness, or maybe of something more? The other question would be how to acknowledge both the peripherality of the region as the consequence of neoliberal transition, reproducing or creating new inequalities between Western Europe and South and Eastern Europe, and at the same time, the privileged place on earth of all European Union members, if you consider a more global context, where Europe is not the only point of reference, the only, the next question would be how to use socialist legacy to seek inspiration for creating for creating more equal and equitable world in our post-socialist context. And the last question would be, is the victimization of gender ideology or the LGBT ideology as an example of this kind of use of post-colonial rhetoric, is this the only possible critique of capitalism that can be popular and appeal to the people? At the same time, well, in other words, it is a question of the possibility of left-wing populism. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you also for asking these very important and thought-provoking questions. I hope some of our guests will be courageous enough to tackle some of these questions. I'll give you the possibility to do so, but after Ivan's Kalmar speech, now this is time for me to invite Ivan. And just a few words about Ivan. He's a professor of anthropology at the University of Toronto. Over his career, much of his work has focused on the image of Jews and Muslims in Western cultural history. He's now conducting a 5-year research project on illiberal tendencies in the east of the European Union, involving an international team of researchers in Europe and Canada. Some of the results of this research will be published in a book he's at work at, provisionally entitled Illiberalism in Central Europe, by Bristol University Press. Ivan Kalmar is the author of Early Orientalism, Imagined Islam, and The Nation of the Sublime Power by Routledge, and co-editor of the volume Orientalism and the Jews, which is by the publisher New England. He has recently guest edited a special issue of Patterns of Prejudice, dealing with Islamophobia in the east of the European Union, and a special issue on Islamophobia in Germany for the Journal of Contemporary European Studies. Ivan, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Thank you for being with us. The floor is yours. You need to unmute yourself, please. Yes.
Thank you very much, Konrad, for the generous introduction. And I'd also like to thank you for being an organizer of this amazing event, together with Hana and Kasia and Špela. And thank you for inviting me. I'd like to start by invoking two tragic events. On October 14th, 2017, a Polish immigrant to Canada, Robert Jekański, was killed after being tasered, or as a result of being tasered by the police at the Vancouver airport. In February 2018, Józef Chovanec, a Slovak who was in Belgium, was killed by the airport police at Charleroi. Both of them were giving some kind of trouble to the authorities, but there's no evidence of them having been particularly violent or endangering the forces of order. Chovanec's wife, Henrietta, told the Belgian publication at Laatste Nieuws, quote, "After the videos of the arrest of the American George Floyd, I immediately thought, quote, my husband died the same way, except that police also laughed out loud, and my husband and the policewoman next to him did a Hitler salute." Currently, a lot of us academics are talking critically about the concept of whiteness, and the possibility that people who are classified as white by the general public can actually have degrees of whiteness, and that whiteness is a matter of negotiation, and you can acquire it, or you can lose it, or you can acquire some and lose some. And one of the things that I am working on and wonder how far one can push this idea, and other people working on it too, is that Eastern Europeans are becoming less white. The decrease in the whiteness of Eastern Europeans, the singling out of Eastern Europeans as a different kind of white population, as the other Europe, as we now say somewhat uncritically, to my knowledge, this began only in the Cold War. So in the Cold War, the Eastern European became less white, but after the Cold War, even more so, and I think that we can speak of a racialization that's ongoing now of the Eastern European. The switch from communist socialism to neoliberal capitalism led to an increase and not a decrease of talk about the immutable difference between Eastern and Western Europeans. I call this Eastern Europeanism on the model of Orientalism. The idea that Eastern Europeans are living in a very different part of the world that has characteristics not shared with and inferior to the West. And in fact, in many ways, those characteristics can be compared to the Orientals, quote unquote, that Orientalism targets. The Brexit debate has exacerbated this racialization greatly. A widely discussed recent addition to the record of Eastern Europeanism, in my opinion, is the book The Light That Failed, that recently came out, written by Ivan Krastev, by Krastev and Holmes. And its thesis is that the post-1989 so-called transition failed. Okay, the book is called The Light That Failed. So Western liberal democracy would have been the light that, at least in Central Europe and in Russia, failed. I call this an Eastern Europeanist approach for many reasons, but especially because of the central thesis of the book, which the authors describe as the imitation imperative. And the idea is that Eastern Europeans tried after 1989 to imitate the West, but they were not successful. Now, I don't want to oversimplify Krastev and Holmes's approach, because the book is worth reading and there's a lot of good scholarship and interesting facts in it. But the very concept of imitation suggests an immutable difference. And the idea that Central Europe is a stranger to liberal democracy as an idea is almost an insult to those who have fought for democratic and often liberal values in Central Europe. So there's some superficial merit to the imitation thesis, because everybody, I think, in this room agrees that the current Western models, the neoliberal capitalist model that was imported after 1989, should not have been imported. But to look at it as an imitation denies the fact that Central Europe always has been part of Europe, even during socialism, and the situation is complicated. And worst of all, the book elades the role of the West. Okay, so it's just some kind of cultural impossibility for the East to adopt Western ways. But isn't it that the real problem is not so much the cultural difference of Central Europe or its desire to be Western, but the Western capital's desire not to allow Eastern Europe to be fully Western, because it regards Central Europe as a source of cheap labor and as a new market. And in structural terms, therefore, as a post-colony. In this context, I think that Homi Bhabha's famous 1984 article on colonial mimicry is a better way to deal with what we might want to call imitation than Krastev and Holmes's book. And Bhabha's approach is about people in the colonies who have adopted Western ways. So the phrase he uses is they are the same, but not quite. And unlike Krastev and Holmes, Bhabha is sensitive to the fact that this is resented by the core, it's resented by the privilege, and that the alienation of the colonial, I think he really does have the colonial elite in mind, but that's another story. The alienation of the colonial is an artifact of Western agency, much more than some inherent colonial difference. So I use the phrase white but not quite in place of almost the same but not quite, to describe how Central Europe and perhaps much of the rest of Eastern Europe fits into this. So the right wing, as Claudia and perhaps others have pointed out, has been sensitive, unlike Krastev and Holmes and many Western scholars. The right wing in the area has been sensitive to the similarity of the area's situation and of its relationship to the West, to the post-colony. And they've adopted the post-colonial language. So I'm going to quote Viktor Orban, who 2 days ago made a very important speech that I think it's a good idea for people to read. It's published in English on the Hungarian Prime Minister's website. Quote, "The 2010 change of government in Hungary and constitutional revolution offered the opportunity to dismantle the frameworks and structures that serve the interests of the liberal and colonizing global elite," unquote. It's very typical for Orban to speak in this way. One thing I would sort of modify in what I heard Claudia say is that the right wing is not sensitive to a critique of capitalism that we want to be making. And I think they actually are in their own perverse way. Perhaps Hana knows this book, okay, How We Have Become a Colony, by the Czech economist Ilona Švihlíková. And it's worth reading. It's quite sophisticated. It's written by a nationalist with right-wing convictions, but it's actually a pretty good analysis of neoliberalism and how the West is exploiting Central Europe economically and politically. The grievance, not only is the grievance real, but I think actually, although the right is giving the wrong answer, it's not totally misunderstood by the right. So I think that's a great topic for discussion. So I think I don't have that much time. How much time do I have? 2 minutes, okay. Many of the speakers have explained that Central Europe is both the sort of object of colonialism, post-colonialism, but also the subject. Okay, and Central Europeans have for a long time felt entitled to, quote unquote, return to the West. I'm not sure that this also applies to many other parts of Eastern Europe, but in Central Europe, a lot of people have always felt they belong to the West. So after 1989, they would be rejoining it. And so to return to a position of global exploiter rather than global exploited. And contrary to common belief, East Central Europe did benefit from the advantages of 19th and 20th century Western imperialism, even though it was perhaps a peripheral part of the colonizing West, and they did not have the nations there. Well, even that needs to be qualified, didn't have their own colonies, but that's assuming that Austria-Hungary was completely alien to Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, and Poles, which we don't want to assume, and Austria-Hungary arguably was a colonial power. So, but because the right wing has a desire to be regarded as a white, potentially colonial power, the right is even more insulted than the left by this kind of pseudo or quasi-colonial racialization of Eastern Europe. And perhaps they're actually even more attuned to what's happening than our academics and others on the left. So the aggrieved illiberals on the right feel rejected in their birthright to be Western, or to call a spade, to enjoy white privilege. This is an important element that unites illiberalism in Central Europe with illiberalism elsewhere. The anxiety of those who feel that white privilege is something they still have but stand to lose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for these inspiring thoughts and for keeping the time as well. I have a question to you, but before I pose this question, I would like to give the chance to the speakers to share a short minute to maximum reflections on the other speakers' contribution. And before I open also the discussion for Q&A, we have 174 participants of this meeting, and many have already asked questions. We would like to give the opportunity to them as well to participate in the discussion. So, but before opening up, Hana, would you like to start with comments to other contributions?
Thank you so much. This was really, really wonderful. I'll be very short. So I really like Piro's work, and we kind of, we seem to be focusing on the same, who speaks for the post-socialist subject. I think his question is really important. And the other thing I would bring out is the question of solidarity. I think that, like me, I think what I found in his, in his contribution is this, is this lack of solidarity with the other that is beyond the West and is beyond Eastern Europe, the colonial subject, the real colonial subject. How we cannot sort of cross beyond. I think it's connected to our inability to cross beyond the national. We understand post-coloniality in national terms. And what I see the greatest chance for us in post-colonial thought is in crossing the national and crossing the regional and becoming part of a global development, global emancipation, global critique of coloniality. And so his thoughts really resonated with me, and of course so do Claudia's on the Polish example. And her questions about the right, about the taking, sort of this appropriation of the post-colonial by the right, and the inability or unwillingness of the left to do that. That's a very interesting and I think very relevant question. And I argue this elsewhere. I never wrote about it, but I need to return to, there's this famous concept by anthropologist Michael Herzfeld. It's a very old concept, but I think it's really relevant still, the concept of cultural intimacy. And I think that this, production of homogeneity in our imagination, how we imagine our place in the world and our societies, that is related, that is a part of our cultural intimacy. It's something that binds us together. And the right-wing leaders in the countries, in some of the countries that were mentioned today, definitely Poland and Hungary, are building and are strengthening that sense of intimacy, which is the defining of the nation against the internal and external other. And that resistance to coloniality, to taking the post-colonial thought to dismantle the homogeneity of our national imaginaries and critically turn the eye onto the inside as well as the outside is a part of the same coin. And then with Ivan, I appreciate that he called attention to the othering of Eastern Europe and the racialization, and I think we have to keep that in mind, that we are not talking about homogeneous societies, and that there are degrees of whiteness, and I find it relevant, and I think we do have to take seriously the way that the conservative and right-wing discourse is using thoughts like post-coloniality. So thank you so much to all of you. It was really inspiring, and thank you for making me a part of this.
Thank you very much, Hana. Piro, would you like to comment now?
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with Hana. I would just add also to the comments of the presentation of Claudia and Ivan about the far right and their claim of colonization, in the sense that there's a lot there also that is written by Christianity and Europeanness and the Christian secular divide that emerges in this discourse of who is truly white and who is truly European. And so Dacia Janowska, for instance, does a lot of work on how post-socialist Polish right reinvents itself and resituates itself outside of the, let's say, socialist spectrum by going back to this temporal framework of the medieval ages, when the Poles become the archetypical whites, the archetypical defenders of Christendom, the true Europeans. In other words, they move the center of whiteness towards Poland. So this discourse is not so much about Western colonization of, or Western European colonization of Eastern Europeans, but I think a lot of it has to do with questions around secularism as well, which rarely makes it into Eastern European studies, given that that's also within this area, Cold War area studies specializations, we tend to think about the secular religious divide only within the context of the Middle East, or let's say Muslim majority countries, more broadly speaking. And I think it would be interesting to look at how religion and secularism also plays a role in kind of providing the rights and fascist groups to claim whiteness by way of race and religion. Yeah, I have no other comments. I think all the presentations have been truly inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piro. Claudia, I want to give the chance you to comment.
Yes. Thank you for your brilliant and inspiring contributions. It was really inspiring to me. Hana, I think it is extremely important to look to the inside, to analyze our own colonial entanglement, and thank you for this, for pointing out to this. Piro, actually, it could be found in all of your contributions. The focus on the necessity of solidarity as something which could be the reaction to such kind of phenomena, like, for example, nesting Orientalism or colonial fantasies. Yeah, I think it's really important to analyze the possibility of solidarity in this decolonial context. I think I have no more comments. Of course, I have a lot of questions, but maybe I give the voice to
yeah. If you allow also participants to ask questions, yeah, and then surely we'll give you a chance. I also have a question I want to give the chance to Ivan to comment, but I also want to start also with questions. Maybe it's a good time before we will give a chance others to ask. And my question is related to the last part of your talk, when you talked about features of illiberalism. You've argued that anxiety of those who feel that white privilege is something they still stand to lose is a feature that unites illiberalism in the Central and Eastern Europe and elsewhere. And I was wondering, what are, in your view, the major features of the CEE illiberalism that make it differ from those in other parts of the world? So, but please also do comments on other contributions if you feel like.
Thank you, Konrad. Actually, my comments, starting with Hana's, might go towards dealing also with your question to me, Konrad. I liked very much not only Hana's presentation, but also the comments after, and where she's talking about how we have to go beyond the national and beyond the regional. I mean, to insist on analyzing things in national and regional ways is a methodological error, and we need to go to the global. And I think it's a very productive intervention and very important and really troubling. We have to know how to calibrate this. I think we have to look at illiberalism in global terms and also local terms. But the local terms don't have to be those that are produced within disciplinary regionalisms that may have been actually created by colonialism, quasi-colonialism, core peripherally relations between capitalists, imperialist powers, and the rest. And I'm referring actually to the concept of Eastern Europe. I'm struggling with it, and I'm not sure how far I want to push this, but it's a difficult question, because Eastern Europe was perhaps co-created by academics the same way as the Orient was co-created by academics who were in Oriental studies, and Eastern Europe studied by scholars often in Eastern European studies. And if we want to have the solidarities that Piro refers to, which is very important, I think, you know, it's a very troubling situation. Like, which solidarities, who's supposed to be solidary with whom? Like, do we want to maintain Eastern Europe as a framework, and Eastern Europeans should be solidary with third world people? Or is it that Roma in Europe, whether East or West, should be solidary with people in similar marginalized situations in the rest of the world? Is it that LGBT people should be solidary with each other? Or, I mean, obviously these things overlap, and I know that that's the answer, but the issue is troubling. Okay, and I think when we look at things in terms of post-colonial, decolonial issues, that we have to be careful that we don't actually methodologically follow boundaries that were created within the colonial capitalist post-colonial system. I found Piro's contribution incredibly stimulating, and so I partly was thinking about this. And also the point about Christianity versus secularism. Now, once again, the rhetoric that the Polish right has is specific in Polish terms, in that it focuses, as Piro so elegantly put it, whiteness towards Poland, so how white Poles are. But really, when you look at the rhetoric of Christian values in Central Europe, it isn't that different from the rhetoric of Christian values in Western Europe or in America. And within Central Europe, Poland, where Christianity is so important politically, is probably far more into this, or more explicitly, than Czech Republic or Hungary, or even perhaps Slovakia. So that's another great contribution. And Claudia asked the right questions, as well as inspiring us with an interesting presentation. I think the socialist legacy question, like what use can be made of it, is also made interesting by the fact that what we find is a lot of sort of nostalgia, like nostalgia for the socialist period. Is that something that can be made use of? I don't know. And certainly the use of gender ideology, which is actually a term perhaps invented in Poland, I don't know. Gender ideology has replaced Islamophobia. I mean, my work started with Islamophobia, and I had to kind of broaden it because Islamophobia has become relatively trivial in the region, and the same, like where it was Muslims before, it's now gay and other LGBTQ plus population. So very interesting. I'm looking. Well, Konrad, I didn't answer your question. What I meant by illiberalism having to do with holding on to the remaining and endangered white privilege. So we can say that about rural white people in Western Europe and America, or about white working class unionized people in the American Rust Belt. That's what I meant. Again, there's a global picture, but of course there are also local pictures. Now, is there a local picture that's common to all of Central Europe and all of Southeastern Europe? And is it the same thing that those two regions we have to look at? Obviously, what they have in common is that they were both socialist. So yes, I think there are very good reasons for considering these regions together, because the question is, what's the relationship between post-socialism and illiberalism? I'm using illiberalism, I know it's a shaky term, but best I can come up with. What's the relationship between post-socialism and illiberalism is a very good question, but I'm still struggling with it, so I'll leave it at that.
All right. Thank you very much. Anyway, thanks a lot for this. I give now the floor to, we open up for discussion, and I give the lead to Špela, who will lead with me the Q&A.
Thank you, Konrad. Thank you to all the speakers for their interventions and their comments. We now have approximately 45 minutes to open up the discussion to everyone in the chat. We've had quite a lively discussion already in the group chat throughout the presentations. Some people have also indicated that they'd like to ask a question or have already asked questions. So we have a list of people who've already asked some questions. We'd like to give them the chance to do so themselves if they'd like to, or for some people we can also read them out from the chat box. And then we'll take a fresh round to give everyone the chance and to keep the discussion moving. So can I first of all call on, I also apologize for all the mispronunciation I'm about to do in the next 45 minutes. Please, when you do get the chance to speak, correct your name for the record if I get it wrong. But is it Rushandra who posed a question at about 4:46? I believe you wanted to ask it on camera. Yes. If you do want to pose a question, please just unmute yourself and go for it. Otherwise, yes.
Yes, thank you. I was just wondering that we find ourselves in a bit of a conundrum in terms of whose voice is authentic enough to reveal the systems of oppression, because it seems to me there is a tension between Eastern European academics, who oftentimes are white and middle class, and therefore privileged. So, you know, anybody has any thoughts about how do we get out of this issue? Thank you.
Thank you. If anyone would like to respond, just raise your hand or just spit in.
I'd like to hear what Piro has to say about this, because he's the one that most addressed this issue, I believe, among us.
For instance, over the summer, if COVID weren't to happen, we were organizing together with several anti-racist and queer collectives in the Balkans, we were organizing a summer school on race and racism in Eastern and Central Europe. And part of that workshop, or part of the goal of the workshop, was to actually sit back and listen to queer, trans, Roma, Muslim, Albanian activists from the region, in the sense that what they have to say about their experiences of racism, as opposed to the kind of academic or conceptual agendas that may come out of academia and that may be framed in a particular way. Similarly, another way of doing this would be to actually look at who you're citing in your work. I've tried very carefully, for instance, in last several papers, to always cite local sources, local academics, but particularly underrepresented and underprivileged communities from within Eastern Europe. So, I mean, there's many other ways in which also what governs our subject matter. I mean, I think if I'm going to do research on Macedonia, let's say, or Bulgaria, my priority, frankly, is not going to be the racialization of Bulgarian labor workers in Eastern Europe, although I do think, like I said, that's an important issue. But my priority would be the systematic displacement of Roma and Muslim communities that is going in Bulgaria as we speak. So these would be the issue. These would be some of the ways in which if we have space, if we have a voice, if we have a platform, if we are given that space, we use that space to open up room and hear from those people that are most marginalized within our communities. And I think historically this hasn't been the case. I mean, obviously, like I said, this is not a very clear-cut process because people find themselves in their positions in these very weird intersections that are not always straightforward, right? But the important thing is to always think, well, who is being silenced right now? So I was doing research and traveling in Greece and in Bulgaria during what came to be known as the refugee crisis. And my research question was not guided by what I was interested to say about Islam in Bulgaria, but rather what I encountered there, for instance, is the fact that many NGOs and academics were very interested in the Roma question, but the fact that majority of the Roma in Bulgaria are Muslim and majority of their discrimination comes out of their faith usually are disconnected. So there's the kind of picking and choosing that happens to sort of fit these categories of what is left out and how things are framed. And I think these are some of the ways. I'm not saying I have the answer, but I think listening to those voices, knowing when to speak and knowing when to sit back and listen to marginalized voices, I think it's something that we need to start observing. And I know that, like I said, in Eastern Europe, this is not a straight forward, but for that matter, it's not the question of positionality and silenced and erased histories is not a straightforward issue anywhere in the world. So the other thing that I want to bring up is, of course, how sometimes when we speak of coloniality, and racism in particular, we think of racism only as a colonial formation. In this sense, we sometimes forget that racism, and particularly colorism and caste, exists in pre-colonial formations, and that colonial regimes usually adopted and manipulated these caste systems and colorisms to create new forms and infrastructures of exploitation. And I think those are also very important conversations to have from a historical perspective. Like some people in the comments mentioned the question about post-colonialism in the intersection of post-Ottoman and Russian empire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piro. We have next on the list Zoltan Ginelli, but I'm not sure whether Zoltan is ready to ask the question live. Zoltan, are you ready?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Go ahead.
well, thank you very much. Try to be short.
Yeah, go ahead. Now we can't hear you. Sorry, Zoltan, I'm not able to hear you now. Try again.
Okay.
say something?
Can you hear me?
Yes, now it's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. So I'll try to wrap up because just to focus on the most, I think, perhaps interesting points that have been discussed before, but also try to reflect on some things that have been said. I will try to approach from the direction of global history. And I think that the main problem that the region is struggling with when we talk about these issues of colonialism, anti-colonialism, or decolonialism is that there is little reflection on the wider global histories that the region, about how the region related to coloniality. And the second thing is, I think, is that this has to be discussed in the context of actual structural positions. So it's not just the discourse, but in what structural position, I think, in the capitalist world system, somebody speaks from, and what position Eastern Europe had. I would say that this is a semi-peripheral position, so that's my take. But to go into details like how we approach whiteness, and mostly we focus on these post-1989 events, how international socialism was a sort of tainted and black, ideology in terms of color, and then many felt that whitening is necessary as an anti-communist gesture to become, market-based and then neoliberal constructivist economy. It also entailed this kind of whitening. But of course, then to understand, these post-2010 events connected to the Orban regime as a racist, anti-European, also illiberal position, embracing white heteronormative Christianity, I think is a very reductive critical position. Just to focus on this and to take this out as Orban and this new, global upsurge of these positions are the only ones who sort of invented this. And this has been reproduced by the West also in order to mask, I think, their own racial heritage and reproduce image of a barbaric, Eastern Europe. Whilst I think, and so this is one prime example, I think, how to understand this kind of upsurge of right wing, is that Orban builds on already existing historical positions and identifications of race in a global sense, which is not just about whiteness, or it is a very complicated, regional, I would say semi-peripheral position of whiteness. It might be antagonistic, but just to take the example of Christianity is used as a foreign policy to reach to, for example, sub-Saharan African regions. So Christianity, which is here locally positioned as a white ideology, sometimes positions against, for example, Islam, is in other regions positioning to the racial others and use to geographically close this distance. Or another position, Islamophobia came originally in socialist times, it was anti-Israel and pro-Islam. That was the governmental position during socialism. Later, after 1989, this came out as a sort of anti-Semitism from same people who were promoting this position as a far-right political position. So the far-right supported pro-Islam and anti-Semitism, and then in Orban's case, they turned pro-Israel and then became Islamophobic. And sometimes you see the same actors involved in this transition. It becomes very complicated how and why Eastern Europe tried to maneuver globally, which then produced these kind of ideologies. And then lastly, because I don't want to speak too much, I think that the fact that Eurocentrism and this kind of white racial position has been produced, which I think is much more complicated than just saying that whiteness is also here in Eastern Europe. Of course, we reproduce it, but also other positions like Asia roots or other a sort of racial hybridity, which is also about contesting the hegemonic West. So I think that this whiteness should be approached from a much wider global historical approach, because the knowledge is not there.
Thank you very much, Zoltan.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So I just want to keep up with many other comments and questions that are there on the list. So now I'd like to pass the floor to Bolaji Balagan. Bolaji, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Konrad. Hi, everyone. I'll try to be as brief as I can. I think I completely agree with most of the things that everybody's actually said so far. More importantly, I think rather than trying to restate what already been said, I think Piro makes a very, very important point about looking at many of the issues that actually happen in Central and Eastern Europe from a very, very important global context. Because one of the things that we're talking about here, they may have local or regional or national manifestations, but their circulation is global. We see what goes on in the US, you see a similar trend in the UK, you see a similar trend in Central and Eastern Europe. So there's a way in which global context plays very, very important role in this. So my question to the panel, or to anyone who might wish to respond to this, is simply this, that if we take this global context as maybe just one line of argument, how do they see the role or the way in which racial capitalism is going in Central and Eastern Europe? Is there a place for racial capitalism? Has it got a particular role in which is actually playing out between European and non-Europeans in Central and Eastern Europe? Thanks.
All right, Balaji, and you say that's to anybody, but this question is particularly to whom you would like to
anyone
answer?
can pick it up.
Mm-hmm. All right, who would like to pick it up? Piro? Okay, go ahead.
So that's a very interesting question, because Ruth Gilmore, who wrote this amazing book on California, the prison industrial complex that emerges in California from the 70s to the 80s, actually does connect to what is going in Eastern Europe. And if you put Neda Tanasovsky's argument together with Ruth Gilmore, it makes perfect sense of how, while the West was invested in, let's say, pacifying these warring Eastern European communities, it was simultaneously invested in building this carceral capitalist regime within the United States. And Gilmore argues that these are not disconnected processes. These are actually globally interrelated processes, that they manifest at different rates in different times, depending on the expansion of racial capitalism as a system. So one way of thinking about this is to think of how does this manifest itself in the Balkans, to answer the question. Let's say from 2015 to 2020, there's been the number of carceral spaces in the Balkans, and by carceral spaces I mean detention centers built for migrants, which are privately run and funded with secondment funding by the European Union, has gone from 15 in 2015 to over 60 in 2020. So what you have now is an entire industry that is maintained through funneling of EU funding that goes from prison security, I mean detention camp security, transportation of refugees, food supply to refugees, health supply to refugees. These are all processes that operate on a capitalist level. And one thing that you will notice in Greece, if you go into the camps, you will see, if you ask for receipts, what the companies that provide foods to the carceral camps, the refugee camps, charge are not what the European Union is paying to the companies for this money. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but in other words, they're making a profit in between. Mm-hmm. So similarly, what happens in California in Ruth Gilmore's work in thinking about racial capitalism and carceral capitalism is that the moment you start to see a margin of profit, your target racialization, in other words, is what, to use her term, is what enshrines capitalism. In other words, you use racial hierarchies as a way of building up profit and using the surplus, building from the surplus rather, based on racial hierarchies. So in this case, in the case of Greece, for instance, it works with refugee camps and carceral camps. In the case of Selma's work, as I explained, it works with the kind of excess waste that is produced in the center of cities with the expansion of capitalism and sorry, I think I'm getting COVID here or something. But in other words, with the expansion of capitalism in post-socialist Europe, the excess surplus waste actually goes to be recycled in Roma communities. So the precarious labor of Roma communities is again a product of that racial capitalism. I mean, in other words, capitalism is always racial in the sense that the target is always a racial hierarchy that is already there, but is being utilized to new ends. Thank you.
Hana, you wanted to add something?
That was, you know, much more comprehensive answer. I just wanted to point to, you know, I think there is a difference where race is positioned in a public discourse in the United States, for example, and in Eastern Europe. I think we're talking slightly, even though in both cases we have, you know, racial capitalism relies on the silencing of race as, you know, as an important or a key, you know, element in its functioning and growth. It is different in Eastern Europe, where there is this, you know, for me, a totally fascinating and continuing trend towards sameness that I call, you know, this homogeneity. So I think that there is not this record. I think it has to do with the history of ethnic cleansing and the Holocaust and the, you know, at least in countries like, you know, Poland or the Czech Republic, the real actually visible sameness of people that are there, where race, as the way we understand it, is not seen as an issue. So it is easier, in fact, for racial capitalism to take a hold, or because of the invisibility of race as a, you know, as a category that matters. While in the US, it's very different, and now of course we see it, you know, and in Western Europe, where you have the presence of what you normally would call, you know, racial difference and race as an issue. So I think in some we are sort of on a different, we are talking about different scales, but I think that paradoxically it is the invisibility of race as a category in Eastern Europe that makes it easier for for racial capitalism to take a hold and function.
Thank you very much, Hana. Ivan wanted to comment yet? Okay, Ivan, please go ahead, but very briefly.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief because I think it's a good idea to have more questions. So, but Zoltan's comments were not commented on yet, and I totally agree with Zoltan. We have to look at these things, including racialization, racial capitalism in global terms, and I hope nobody's suggesting that Orban's case is somehow unique and should be considered on its own. Quite to the contrary, he himself is very aware that this is a global phenomenon and is constantly positioning himself as a leader in what he has recently described as a counter-revolution. And he thinks of himself as a European leader. The use of anti-Semitism to justify Islamophobia, it's something I've written about fairly recently, and my article on this and the George Soros context came out in Patterns of Prejudice, I think just a few months ago. Bolaji made a terrific comment, and Piro and Hana's already commented enough on it, but I'd just like to very briefly put a kind of framework on this, that how I see it is that Central Europe is in an ambiguous situation because, for one thing, Western capital needs to co-opt it and to separate it from the third world, as somebody has already mentioned. So, for example, placing anti-ballistic defense systems in Poland, or before that, they discussed the Czech Republic, continues to cement this alliance between especially the US and the so-called New Europe, and is trying to integrate it militarily in the West dominated by racial capitalism. But at the same time, as I said, and contradictory to this, the West needs the cheap labor that is closer to the West than Africa or Asia, and the markets. Okay, so the racial capitalism enters the area both as an ally and as an exploiter. I agree with Hana that it may be a little different in terms of the internal dynamics, and I don't have an answer to what I think is a pretty good question, is can we see influence from the capitalist West that seems to exacerbate, to increase the racial discrimination against the Roma, who I think are the prime example of racially oppressed group in the area. That I don't know.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Špela?
Thank you. So we'll take a few questions and comments at a time now. And since we only have 20 minutes to go, if I can just gently but firmly ask everyone to keep both questions and replies as succinct as possible so we can give more people a chance to take part in the discussion. So I'd like to call on Middlesex Kumar to ask the next question.
Thank you, Špela. I have had an opportunity to be part of this debate on decoloniality in Central and Eastern Europe from a post-colonial point of, my location. And my question emanates from that, and it is a general question anyone can answer if they want to. You see, one of the things that post-colonial theory, as it was practiced, let's say in India, for example, was its investment in the concept of modernity. It was almost the case that the question of nation, or the question of capitalism, or the question of state formation, so on and so forth, even in the global context, was taken up as a question of modernity, as something, as an encounter between the East and the West. That was the framework. You know, capitalism develops, but it develops it its own way, and so on and so forth. I don't know if modernity becomes a point of debate in the decolonial discussions in Eastern and Central Europe. And it seems to me that because of its post-socialist condition, and I'm using that in a very loose way, the question of modernity always seems to be resolved. It's that because it was a socialist condition, the question of modernity is already resolved. But listening to Ivan's and Piro's presentation, it seemed to me that it is not actually the question of Roma, the question of that community. And finally, what Claudia was asking in her presentation as to what is sexy about post-colonial theory, and I was just wondering, maybe because it's the anti-modernist stance or anti-modern stance, which makes it quite appropriable for the right winger, because in the same way, in India, for example, the right-wing Hindu governments are using the anti-modern, almost post-colonial rhetoric, and maybe the point that about illiberalism, by Ivan, maybe it's anti-modernity as well. I mean, it's just something it came to me. So I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Middlesex. Would any of the speakers like to respond?
I can try to answer this question. Yeah. Well, what I research now is the history of Polish early integral nationalism. It's a the same kind of movement or ideology as, for example, Nazism in Germany or fascism in Italy. And Roman Dmowski was the leader of the movement in the 19th century in Poland, and his most important and famous book was The Thoughts of Modern Pole. And it is really important to remember that the integral nationalism was the dream of being modern, and it meant to be like Great Britain, like a British Empire. So to be a capitalist, colonial, well, to conquer the world, the modern capitalist world. So we can't say that, for example, the nationalists in Poland, but also in Germany, I think that they were, for example, conservatives. No, their aspirations was to be modern. So we can't talk about Polish or maybe East European post-colonial condition without acknowledging this nationalist tradition and without acknowledging its ambition to be modern, to participate in this modern world. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. I'm just going to read a comment that Ere Charlie left in the chat box earlier that I think Catherine can then build on after that. So Ere's comment was, the conversation today has tended to couple the prefix post with socialism and colonialism. I'm wondering if and how we might bring these insights into a relationship with another posteriority which relates to the region, but of which we have not heard much today, that of post-Ottoman. In asking this, I have in mind not only the growing and often troubling trend among some scholars to use the category of post-Ottoman as something of a way out of the predicaments associated with post-colonialism and post-socialism, but also the growing relations in recent years between the right-wing governments of countries like Hungary, Serbia, and Turkey. So, Catherine Baker, if you want to respond to that, then perhaps the speakers can come in after these two joint interventions.
Yeah, seeing Ere's comment reminded me of the way the post-Ottoman fame seems to come up when we think about historicising the Western Balkan refugee crisis, as policymakers keep on calling it. And, you know, particularly as we've already heard today, the situations that's turned out in Bosnia. In almost all conceptualizations of this, you know, Bosnia and Syria and Iraq are, you know, understood as, you know, these two separate regions, these two separate ends of the Balkan route. But then from a longer historical perspective, then, you know, also they are, you know, two parts of the same historical afterlife of the Ottoman Empire. And, you know, this is a framing which, outside the work of people like Dusan Bielic sometimes, and, you know, Daryl Lee's work as well in a way, I feel that I have very rarely been challenged to think with. So, you know, I'd be interested in, you know, what any of our speakers might think about that frame.
Would any of the speakers like to respond?
Piro?
I don't, well, I don't want to take up too much space, but I'll try to address both the question then that Mithilesh raises about modernity and this question about the post-Ottoman world, because they're actually interrelated. And there's great work done by Leyla Amzier Dogdular on the post-Ottoman quandrum that Muslims in Bosnia faced during the invasion and subsequent colonization of Bosnia by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so the question of modernity, how to modernize as Muslims, should we stay in the Balkans or leave? Some leave and return. I suggest everybody read this work. It's brilliant work on small but rather significant debates on modernity, subjectivity, colonization, and Islam in actual Eastern Europe, because these debates happen within the Muslim community. What I find interesting about the post-Ottoman refugee relation, as Catherine also pointed out, is that there are actual Syrian refugees who are coming back to Greece, to Crete, who are coming back to Macedonia, to Bosnia, to Kosovo, who are actually descendants of Balkan, generally Bosnian or Albanian refugees who were expelled to Turkey and Syria in the late 19th and early 20th century with a population exchange. So many of them are actually receiving citizenship. Some of them have started legal processes to reclaim property in Crete in particular, but also Kosovo. So these are very interesting cases that trouble this very distinct division between post-colonial, post-socialist, and so the Ottoman framework that comes in and practically ruins all of these Eurocentric divisions. The other work that I find fascinating on modernity and how modernity was approached, particularly from Muslim communities in Eastern Europe, is Janita Skaric's work on how Muslims in the Balkans conceptualized the Muslim world and the Ummah as sort of an alternative to what was being forced as a modernizing project, not just during the post-Ottoman Yugoslav royal project, but also during the socialist period.
Hi, thank you, Piro. Just trying to see if a video is here, would like to make his point. Otherwise, we'll just move on quite quickly to the next question so we can fit another one in. Right. Adriana, would you like to ask your question to Ivan?
Yes, thank you very much. Ivan, I asked a question to you in particular, but also to everybody else. I'm having a project on trust and corruption, and I have read quite a lot on that, but I don't feel like I put the finger right on the where I feel I should. And you talked about the relationship between illiberalism and post-communism, as well as about some socialist legacies in terms of, you mentioned nostalgia. Could you say that post-colonial theory could help me understand better this question on trust and corruption in Romania? Thank you.
That is a real tough one, Adriana, addressed to me. I wonder if other people know more about it. So it's about corruption and the relationship between illiberalism and post-colonialism. Well, yeah, I mean, we have to, it's a very big and very broad question, and we have to look at the transition, as I suggested before, after 1989, not in culturalist terms about, you know, how Eastern Europeans are, not in racialized terms, but in terms of the interaction between East and West, where the West was predominant. Okay, and the model at the time, as many authors have pointed out, was the neoliberal model that minimized, at least in theory, the intervention of the state. So that being the model and state control being diminished, also lack of capital in the East have led to what was called the Wild East. Now, I think that the period that we see today is a reaction to the Wild East period, that illiberalism is actually a way to correct it. And the popularity of illiberalism lies in decreasing the chaos and at least saying that it fights corruption. Because you and I know that, that in fact corruption is rampant, but at least corruption is not chaotic. Okay, with government intervention, there's more control over the corruption. But I would encourage anyone to look at it in terms of interactions between Western capital and their history in the East. I'll say something really very quickly, it'll only take a few seconds. It occurred to me, and it's something that's kind of exciting to me now, is that, so we talk about the post-Ottoman situation, and we look at the Ottoman Empire, and I'm sure that it's way much more relevant than the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But we have to look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire when we talk about colonial history in Central Europe. And we have to get away from this nationalist discourse that Czechs and Hungarians and Slovaks were simply victims of Austria, German Austria, and revisit that story. And I think we'll see that that in fact, you know, Austria-Hungary may have been a peripheral colonial power, but the subjects of Austria-Hungary who identified with non-German nationality were pretty well actively involved in whatever Austria-Hungary was doing, and were, for the most part, were loyal subjects.
Thank you, Ivan. So we only have 5 minutes to go, which means that we can take one last very quick question from the floor. If you do have a question, please post it in the chat box, or rather just say they'd like to ask a question in the chat box, because it's quite hard to keep an eye on the raised hands. Any takers? I'd also like to call on the speakers if they have anything last they'd like to say. Oh, hang on, we do have a question. Sorry, speakers. Romina, would you like to ask your question, or do you want to send it to me and I can pose it?
You're muted, Romina.
Thank you. I've done this so many times, still not used to unmuting. I think my camera is also on. It's mostly some reflections, and I'm sorry, I'm not necessarily specializing in the region, so I waited until the end. But I think listening to you, I thought of a few reflections that I want to share as food for thought. It sounds to me like there are multiple, essentially we use language, the same discourse, you know, racism or race that is being used in the mainstream. I'm based in the UK, but we use them in different ways and with different meanings. And I think there needs to be recognition that language is not just language and discourse, but it's also metaphysics. It assumes certain theoretical metaphysical premises. So when we transpose a terminology to another context, we actually transpose also the metaphysics and the more profound beliefs and assumptions that are being made, whether it is about humanity, what is a human being, or what is race, or what is ethnicity. So I think it is really important to delve deeper into belief systems and knowledge systems. And that really brings up the question of, or the need for ethnographic research and really historicizing, you know, whatever arguments that we develop or investigations that we look to conduct. And you know, that is implicated with many ethical concerns, because obviously when you do ethnographic research, which is subjectivity based, you know, your positionality matters really, and it becomes your own limitation. So then I think there needs to be a bit more reflection, perhaps a more ethical reflection around, you know, knowledge production and how we, given our positionalities, can actually speak, you know, or contribute something that hasn't been said before, something that can, you know, can provide a different, you know, narrative that hasn't been provided yet. I wonder what the speakers are thinking about that point.
Thank you, Romina. Is there anyone who'd like to give a very quick response to that? Piro, go for it.
I mean, I totally agree that racism and racialization are contextual embodiments and operate differently in different contexts. However, when it comes to racial capitalism, in my mind, there are certain logics around which racial capitalism operates across the world, in the sense that how the exploitation of labor relies on racial hierarchies that these may have different historical trajectories is definitely true, but how that exploitation relies on racial hierarchies, for me especially, is sometimes unquestionable. Having said that, yes, there are, like I mentioned also earlier, also pre-colonial formations of race and racism. But I mean, I couldn't agree more, but that would, to address all those nuances, I think we would have to do an entirely different, that would be a great idea for a different workshop. And namely, that's what we had in mind with the workshop we wanted to do on race and racism in the Balkans over the summer that we unfortunately couldn't do. But in principle, yes, I couldn't agree more.
Thank you very much, Piro, for that. That was really, really excellent. And
I think Hana wanted to just briefly come in. Hana, did we see her?
Yes.
Yeah, just very briefly. This might sound controversial, but you know, when a little bit building on what Piro said, I think that for me, what was a very interesting process was starting to use when I still lived in Poland, and I started using the term race and racism to speak about the invisible types of discrimination, you know, that were silenced, both historically, you know, in terms of memory, in terms of also contemporary practices. You know, because let's say, you know, Jews look the same, right? So saying, you know, speaking about anti-Semitism in Poland in terms of racism was controversial, but was empowering. It was, you know, bringing that discourse, which is from another context now, but bringing that to the discussions to the local discussions in Central Europe, I felt was empowering, and it was a part of sort of my academic engagement. You know, steering a discussion about it. So I think, yeah, I just wanted to say that in terms of the categories and the epistemes, that they can function even, you know, they can function like that too.
Yes, thank you very much, Hana, for this. It's an important thing to say. We are aware of time, and unfortunately, it's time to wrap up. So let me just say literally a couple of words before we finish this event. So first of all, massive thank you to our brilliant speakers. We've learned so much today. Your talks have been truly inspiring. Thank you so much for contributing. We'd also like to thank each and every of you participants for joining us today, for asking questions, for being so active in the chat box, for making this conversation really lively and dynamic. We're planning to post the recording from this event on YouTube, and we'll send you an email via Eventbrite when the video is available. I'd also like to say that this event is the first of a series of events that we'll be organizing in the next few years. So to learn about the future events that we'll be organizing, please check out our network website and follow us on Twitter. Špela, if you could maybe post the slide with the details. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Špela. So thank you again, everyone, for joining today. And thank you, speakers. Thank you, co-organizers, Kasia, Špela, and Konrad. It's been a pleasure. And everyone, have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.